Hello class, my name is Alika Edmonds, and I am here presenting to you as a class, as well as my girlfriend Raquel, who is recording.
Hello.
Do you believe white people in America are discriminated and targeted? The increase in racial diversity and equity efforts have been perceived as pushes for white discrimination. There is a significant race gap resulting from the prohibition of wealth accumulation during slavery, and as well as the unequal treatment after emancipation. Minority equity efforts are necessary in bridging this race gap. Affirmative action is one of the equity efforts that enhances the university experience with diversified classrooms and movements towards equal opportunities for minorities. It is not discrimination against white people. With increased racial diversity and equity efforts, white Americans feel vulnerable to racial discrimination. This belief can be seen in 55% of white Americans that believe there is discrimination against white people in the United States. This is from an NPR survey. They believe it is a zero-sum game, meaning that as racial discrimination against minorities increases, or actually as it decreases, discrimination against white people increases. White Republicans supporting Trump see anti-white bias as more prevalent than anti-black bias. From hbs.edu. A Washington Post ABC News poll during last year's election campaign asked, which was a bigger problem in this country? Blacks and Hispanics losing out because of preferences for whites, or whites losing out because of preferences for blacks and Hispanics? The overwhelming answer from Trump supporters was a 54% compared to a 12% that supported that preferences for black and Latino people were hurting white people. The increase in racial diversity is parallel to the race gap that continues to persist. Could you pass me the first picture? Seen in this first visual graph, on average, black male offenders receive federal sentences almost 20% longer than white male offenders for the same crime. And as you can see, each year the percent goes up. Black families have 1/10 of the net worth that white families have. Median net worth of families headed by a white person with a bachelor's degree was $397,000 as of 2016. For households headed by a college-educated black person, it was $68,000, less than a white person without a degree. Disparities carry over into basic life. Black households are 2.5 times more likely to experience food insecurity than white households, noted from Global Race. It also continues in schools. Less than a third of black students attain a bachelor's degree or higher, compared to half of white students. The race gap comes from the historical barring of wealth accumulation. This is a consequence of many decades of racial inequality that imposed barriers to wealth accumulation through explicit prohibition during slavery and unequal treatment after emancipation. Could you pass me the next visual? Thank you. Discrimination in labor market is in labor markets and redlining, reducing access to capital in black neighborhoods. Redlining is segregating communities by housing. Federal housing policies created after the Depression ensured that African Americans and other people of color were left out of the new suburban communities, noted from NPR. Here is a picture of one of the public projects that was included in the redlining segregation of communities. History explains the racial wealth gap, while affirmative action is a step towards offering minorities equal opportunity. Affirmative action is necessary and is not a knock on white people. It is intended to increase educational and employment opportunities for underrepresented groups. It is there to give a fair chance to compete and succeed, as seen in aclu.org. One of the biggest points and counter-arguments against affirmative action is that it is limiting opportunities for white Americans to get into these competitive colleges. White enrollment has not increased at competitive colleges in states that ban affirmative action, as seen in Inside Higher Ed. In conclusion, minority discrimination is still prevalent today, as seen in disparities in public perceptions that have been passed down from generations before. With increased equity efforts and the diversification of America, this is not the rise of white discrimination. Minorities are experiencing a fight of their own to bridge the wealth gap that slavery was a catalyst for. Affirmative action is simply a step forward for minorities, not a step back for white people. Thank you for listening to my presentation. If there is any questions, I am open to answering them. First question. You are white and you do not understand what the premise of this presentation was and how it applies to you. Well, it is simply to bring you understanding on why the equity efforts are necessary and how they do not target white people. Another question is, what can you do as a white person? Well, be informed. Whether you agree or disagree, the disparities and effects of slavery are prevalent today, seen in individual bias, systemic racism, and discrimination. And we have one question from the audience.
Well, why can't these minority students just earn the right to go to this college themselves instead of needing some special program to get them in?
Well, as seen in this racial wealth gap, it is a generational disparity. It has been the holding back of wealth accumulation during slavery, in which it was strictly prohibited, as well as the unequal treatment after emancipation. So even though today is 400 years later from slavery, these generations of minorities have not been able to build the same wealth at the same speed as many middle-class white people or upper class. So they are not in the same boat. So balancing these opportunities for minorities is what affirmative action is used for.
Are you trying to say the gap is too big, or it still is too big for them to fill, having all these years pass by since slavery actually occurred?
I'm saying that the gap is far too big to even explain by just the historical information I provided in this presentation. The gap comes from many different things, systemic racism included, in which a lot of the opportunities are limited, not just on the surface, but built into the system that America was founded on.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for your questions, and thank you for listening to my presentation.
Woo!